Here we go with the urinary system review. Pretty straightforward. You need to be able to identify the functions of the urinary system. So first of all, I think it's clear it filters blood. Lately we've talked about regulating the pH by secreting or absorbing hydrogen ions. We've also talked about electrolyte balances like sodium, potassium. Regulates blood pressure and volume. We talked about aldosterone and angiotensin. Also, it stimulates red blood cell formation, so making a connection to the circulatory system and the skeletal system, it releases EPO. And also, it manufactures the active form of vitamin D, which allows your bones to absorb calcium. You should be able to label the diagram of a urinary system as well as identify the function of each of those components. So we have the kidney bean-shaped kidney, which filters the blood, the ureter, which transports urine to the bladder, the urinary bladder, which simply stores urine, and the urethra, which allows it to exit outside the body. And remember, the male's urethra is longer than the female's. Referring to the three layers that are superficial to the kidneys, so remember superficial is closer to the surface. So you have renal fascia, which is connective tissue holding the kidneys in place. You have the adipose capsule, which adipose is fat. All fat serves to protect organs from mechanical injury. Also, the adrenal gland sits atop the kidney, and then the renal capsule is kind of like the shell of the kidney. While we're here, we can talk about this sectional anatomy of the kidney. So we have the pelvis, which is the opening to the ureter. We have the medulla pyramids here. So that whole layer, medulla middle, makes up the middle layer. That's where you find your collecting ducts. We talked about the cortex, which is the outer layer of the kidney, and a lot of the nephron tubule will be located in the cortex as well. Attached to each of the medullas, you have the minor calyces, calyx for singular. The minor calyx joins with each other minor calyces to form the major calyx, and then the major calyx come together and drain into the pelvis itself. You want to be familiar with the nitrogenous wastes. So urea, uric acid, creatinine, and ammonia, anything with a UR in it is one of your nitrogenous wastes. So if you see those in any answer, you can quickly identify those. So you can see urea comes from the breakdown of protein, uric acid from the breakdown of purines. Purines is one of your nucleic acids. I don't know if you remember that. Creatinine comes from the metabolism of creatine phosphate, which is a backup source of energy. You want to be able to list the stages of urine formation in the proper order, identify where the process takes place and what's happening. So filtration is happening in the renal corpuscle. That would be the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule together. So anything that fits through the pores of the glomerulus will be filtered into the Bowman's capsule due to high force, high pressure. Reabsorption takes place kind of throughout the whole nephron, but the majority takes place in the proximal convoluted tubule. The things you need are reabsorbed. Collecting duct mostly, oh, I jumped ahead, sorry. The loop of Henle collects water and salt, and then secretion occurs in the distal convoluted tubule. For the most part, you're secreting things that the body hasn't gotten rid of yet. And then finally, the final water adjustments are made in the collecting duct. This was a common question in class today, what ions are typically in higher concentration in the urine than in the plasma. So let's just simplify this. Higher in the urine than in the plasma is potassium ions. And then hydrogen, ammonia, magnesium sulfate, and phosphate are also high in the urine because they can be excreted as waste. And then lower in urine is going to be sodium and bicarbonate because we know they're used to modify blood volume, and blood pH. Another common question today, and there's a link at the bottom if you want to type that in. Carrier-mediated transport has to do with carrier proteins and facilitated diffusion. In some cases, there's carrier proteins that serve active transport. You don't need to know if it's active or passive. You just want to know that carrier proteins are present for substances the body needs, and they help in reabsorbing those items. And then we have carrier proteins that are facing the other direction for those items that our body doesn't need, and so they're going to be secreted. We don't have carrier proteins that will reclaim items our body doesn't need, so those items will just float on by. Your body will reabsorb items that your body needs. So those would be glucose for energy, small proteins if they happen to fit through in the filtrate to begin with. Amino acids are used to make proteins. We're going to reclaim water, hydrogen ions, salt, potassium ions, phosphate, sulfate, chloride, magnesium. So a lot of those ions our bodies will use, remember we call them electrolytes. You have water being reabsorbed pretty much through the entire nephron. So in the DCT, there will be also water being reabsorbed, and sodium and calcium. They often go in the same direction. Potassium and hydrogen ions typically go in the opposite direction. Hydrogen is usually being secreted because it has to do with the pH of your blood. We also secrete any wastes, urea, uric acid, creatinine, maybe antibiotics that you've taken that haven't been absorbed by your body. And then we also have hydrogen and bicarbonate going in reverse direction. So if you reabsorb bicarbonate, you'll secrete hydrogen, and vice versa. If you reabsorb hydrogen, you're going to secrete bicarbonate. Comparing and contrasting ADH and aldosterone, they both have to do with reabsorbing water. So they're both used when your blood volume is low or when you're dehydrated. Aldosterone works slightly different in that it is going to first absorb sodium, and then water follows salt. So by absorbing sodium, it absorbs water, and at the same time it's going to secrete potassium. Aldosterone is produced in the adrenal gland. So when the body recognizes that you are low in blood volume, ADH is going to be produced in the hypothalamus, and the aldosterone will be produced in the adrenal gland. The general characteristics of urine are straw-colored, slightly acidic, slightly aromatic. It has a specific gravity greater than 1, and it is typically clear in consistency, I guess, as in it is not cloudy. The ureters and the urinary bladder are transporting and storing urine. So the urinary bladder stores, and the ureters transports to the urinary bladder. This was a common question. We didn't get this far in our reading or in our lecture, but you had the page number for reference. So micturition is the act of voiding or going to the bathroom. So micturition is a reflex activity. It depends on stretch receptors. So we have different types of receptors, right? So the stretch receptors are in the detrusor muscle, which is in the wall of the bladder. So the receptor's first going to send signals when your bladder has about 200 milliliters of urine. And then when that stimulus doesn't go away, your body ignores it. So you kind of forget that you have to go to the bathroom until your bladder contains 500 milliliters. And then the stretch receptors send signals again. And the reflex portion is opening that internal sphincter, which allows a little bit of urine to trickle out. And the reflex would be the external sphincter quickly closing in order to keep yourself from wetting. Young children are not able to control their sphincters yet. Elderly lose the ability to close those sphincters, so they suffer incontinence, so they're unable to hold it. We made 3 connections with the urinary system. We connected it to the endocrine system because of the EPO and the renin that's released. Renin is actually an enzyme, so I'm not sure if you would consider that endocrine, except it does eventually trigger the release of aldosterone. The respiratory system, we talked about bicarbonate and hydrogen to maintain pH. And then the circulatory system, clearly it regulates the blood by filtering it and maintaining the volume and pH. Here's a bunch of words you may or may not have heard of. Renal calculi refer to kidney stones. Diuretic, diuresis is the formation of urine, so a diuretic increases the ability to form and produce urine. Hematuria, we read this in our case study. So it's the presence of red blood cells in the urine. You could guess that because hema in the first part refers to blood and urea is going to refer to the urine. Incontinence, the inability to control urination. Renal failure, the kidneys fail to remove waste, so they probably have a very low specific gravity. A UTI is the short way of saying urinary tract infection, usually due to a bacteria. Uremia, remember the emias have to do with abnormal conditions. Ur refers to urine, so abnormally high levels of nitrogenous waste in the blood. And urethritis, remember itis is inflammation, and then again, what comes before it is what is inflamed. So urethritis is inflammation of the urethra, probably accompanying a UTI. This answer is short and sweet. How is urine moved? Like all smooth muscles that are in a tube, they move things via peristalsis, which is like a squeeze and a push, a squeeze and a push. Voiding has to do with going to the bathroom. So we have to relax both the internal and the external sphincters. The external we voluntarily control. The internal is kind of on its own. And we also have to contract the detrusor muscle of the bladder. So the external sphincter is under voluntary control, like I said. So that allows you to choose when it's convenient to go. If you wait long enough, you will lose this voluntary control. But as we learned in an earlier slide, you're good for at least 500 milliliters. Here's repetition. The 2 sphincters, internal and external. Which one's voluntary? That'd be the external. So the last couple questions you probably won't see on the test because we were short on time. We didn't talk about the bladder. We did talk about the layers of the kidney. So the cortex you want to know is the smooth outer portion. A lot of the nephron is in the cortex. The medulla is the inner portion. It's arranged in pyramids. We're going to find the collecting ducts in the nephron. And then the pelvis is kind of like a funnel. It's funneling all the urine down into the ureter. The major calyces drain into the pelvis. The renin-angiotensin mechanism kicks in when our blood volume is low, our blood pressure is low. The enzyme renin is released from the kidney. It converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. Hopefully in the word angiotensin you see angio, which means vessel, and tense. So you're creating more tension. In other words, you are vasoconstricting the blood vessels. So that alone will allow the blood pressure to go up. Angiotensin 2 causes the release of aldosterone, and that causes the reabsorption of sodium, which then reabsorbs water as well. So I don't know if you're reading the slide. It says ADH. That is not correct. So the 2 factors that would trigger the release of renin is either low blood pressure or low sodium levels. So if you can assume that if you've lost a lot of water, you've also lost a lot of salt. And if your blood volume is low, then your blood pressure will be low as well. Usually you'll form dilute urine when you're very well hydrated. Usually when you're underhydrated, you'll form a more concentrated urine. So dehydration occurs because of more reabsorption. Anions are negatively charged ions. Cations are positively charged. So the major anion of the extracellular fluid is chlorine, and the major cation is potassium. The major cation of the intracellular fluid is potassium. Bicarbonate we've talked about before with the respiratory system. We know that it can bind hydrogen and form carbonic acid, or it can release hydrogen and form bicarbonate. So we can break carbonic acid and reabsorb hydrogen and excrete bicarbonate if our blood is too basic, and vice versa. If our blood is too acidic, we'll secrete the hydrogen and retain the bicarbonate. And that's all I got time for. I got a track meet to get to, so hope that's helpful.